Thanks so much for having me. There's been so many great discussions so far about, the state of journalism, the future of journalism, the state of truth, and I'm excited to really throw a wrench in it with something else that's completely different and that will make you question even more. So I hope you are thinking as good journalists, questioning a lot. I just tweeted out the link to this presentation if you want to follow it. You can check out the visuals on your own time as well, because there's some more videos in there that we won't have time to go through all of them. So yeah, be a good journalist, be critically thinking, and I want at the very end to have a great discussion about the decisions that we've made in our case studies that I'm going to be talking about with projects that we've done with Frontline as well as the New York Times. So just be thinking about kind of what I'm talking about as well as some of the projects and the case studies that we're showing today. So yeah, I'm Kevin. Emblematic Group is founded by Nani de la Peña. This is a little bit about her. I have to show the video where Iñárritu says that she's the godmother of VR.
Real VR pioneer, Nani de la Peña.
What if I could present you a story that you remember with your entire body and not just with your mind? So what'd you think?
So this is the Sundance 2012. This is the first time that VR was ever brought to a Sundance thing.
Virtual reality, I can put you on seat in the middle of the story. You get this whole body sensation.
There's a bunch of cops here. They're standing around something's going on.
Oh, right here. That's not cool.
On the other side of a fence, there's all these people just kicking and beating.
We can have what I call this duality of presence. A real feeling as if you're in the middle of something that you normally see on TV news.
So I started applying all these ideas to what I've named immersive journalism. And we all know being there is the most important part of understanding almost anything that's happening.
And that's Iñárritu in 2012. And she's the one who
Along in
showed him
partnership
VR
with
and
America's
led to
premier
his
investigative
piece.
documentary series, Frontline, who had incredible access on solitary confinement cells. What that is photogrammetry. And it's exact photographs of a cell.
So this is a headset capture of what someone's seeing. They're actually walking around.
You are in the room. This works so well for putting people on scene at real stories.
Okay, so there was a lot in that video that I'm going to start to break apart. So I think let's start with the most common form of VR that you've probably experienced or seen on at least YouTube or Facebook, and that's 360 video. So this is a spherical video that's really similar to how traditional video is shot with cameras, but there's 4 cameras instead, or 6 cameras, and it's all stitched together and placed around the viewer like a bubble. So it's spherical and it's quite immersive as well. This is really great, and we've used it as a technology for news that's unfolding. So this is a project that we did. This is actually in German. It's with Arte and the New York Times as well as AJ+. So this is a 360 video. The resolution is, it gets better every single year. And so this was done last year. But what's great about 360 video is it's quite immersive in its, for the cost, you can get photorealism that's quite a lot better than some of the CG stuff we saw in our trailer. So this is a piece about the conflict in Sudan. And we actually brought this to the State Department, which is quite exciting to show the envoy as they're making decisions about what to do with this, whether or not to take off the weapons for Sudan. So you're visually, you're in a foxhole with people as they're hiding from cartoons, bombs that have been bombing the Nuba people in South Sudan. So it's this sense of being with people that you can't really get in traditional media. So this is 360 video. It's easier to produce than the next type of VR that I'm going to be talking about, which is room scale, which I have brought a room scale VR set over there. After this or between sessions, we can experience some different forms of volumetric VR and stories. But I want to kind of clarify the difference between 360 video because it's quite parallel to traditional video, whereas room scale VR is a lot more compared to game development. And so our team is a unique mix of game developers, architects, designers, and investigative journalists. And so this is kind of the difference between room scale walk around VR and 360 video. Because 360 you're in the bubble, room scale behaves like how reality is. There's proprioception, which means there's this ability to see things with parallax, right? Your body moves and you see change. So you're like in the forest and the trees and you're able to walk around and move. So that's the type of VR that I'm going to be talking about mostly. So with volumetric VR, at the heart of like everything that we do is this issue of making people care about issues that people have usually apathy about, or they've read a lot about, and they've become numb. So how do we use immersive media to cut through that and make people start to have a fresh thinking about things and to have more energy about things that typically, like immigration, that have become so divisive in our country's dialogue so far. So this is Anastasio Hernandez Rojas. He lived in America for about 27 years. He was 15 when he came to the country. On Mother's Day, he decided to get his, he shoplifted steak and a bottle of tequila, and he got across the border but was detained. While he was detained, about a dozen border agents beat him up and broke 5 of his ribs. He had missing teeth. He was in a coma, and he eventually died. The case had very little media attention, and this was in 2010. So in the midst of that, this is eyewitness footage from someone's cell phone that the border agents were not able to confiscate. They went around and they tried to confiscate as many people's phones who recorded information off of this as possible. So you can hear many people screaming to tell the border agents to tell them to stop. You can hear his cries for help. This was taken by Ashley Young. And what we did was we brought Ashley Young into our studios, and we had her direct what happened that day, and also what she saw, and she provided with us her eyewitness footage. So we recreated, provided by the Associated Press and Google funding, to create a project that would let you be a witness and have to come to terms with what's going on and try to capture and document this crime that's unfolding, a border patrol beating. So why is this room scale versus 360? I think that's one of the main questions. At the end of the piece, users had a phone the entire time, and they were instructed to take their own rendition and recording of, and try to document what's unfolding. They often didn't quite know what to expect, but once they understood, they had a phone and they saw someone, like pleading for help, and they heard the real audio, they kind of naturally knew what to do. At the end of the piece, they got the video footage with them to share on Facebook. And so that's how we kind of made this a larger message, especially in 2014 when this piece was made. There was not a lot of ways of consuming VR. As you saw earlier in our video, there was like, it required a space about that size and a whole motion capture setup to do this. So it was before the Oculus Rift or before the HTC Vive, and we custom built technologies to make this happen. And so wide room scale so that you can have agency and be the one having to make the decisions and having to document things, what's unfolding. So yeah, it was scrupulously recreated based off of the cell phone evidence of what was happening and where the recording angle of where you are. And so it's just like any form of journalism, but we have to actually be even more, often diligent with our work because we're building worlds here. So every single asset has to be accounted for and has to come from somewhere. So we create Bibles in the beginning of the entire world, and that's what informs our work. It's kind of like with game development. When you're building Halo, you have entire game Bibles of the worlds. And so we do same things to make sure that whenever someone questions our work, we can say, here, no, this is the photo source reference of this fence that came, and that's why it's at this angle. The next piece that we did immediately after this, and this was built in 2 weeks, this was in 2015, right after, in the midst of Black Lives Matter and before the ruling on George Zimmerman. So we had the challenge of kind of taking Trayvon Martin's case and what happened to him that night and cutting through this.
Shannon, I still go back to, I think, the key interview up to this point. Again, not having all the facts, not rushing to judgment on this program the way other networks have. We have 3 networks, and we'll deal with this later in the program. NBC edits a tape that makes it quite incriminating towards Mr. Zimmerman. Then, of course, we have ABC. They get the video of Mr.
So this is a story of a 17-year-old who was walking in a relatively nice suburban complex and was killed. And what we have here is kind of just like the same dribble of like CNN talking heads, Fox talking heads. They're just talking about each other. How do we cut through this and make people actually understand what happened? Because this isn't informing me about what's happening, right? And this is kind of, this piece is the reason why I decided to leave the LA Times and work at this company, is because they were taking all the assets that existed and all the facts and all the truth and combining it in a world and building off of it so that you actually were there and you understood what happened. So all this, the audio that you hear, is recorded from Freedom of Information Act requested voice recordings that the people were making to the police. And then we interviewed the people who were making the calls, and we also got blueprints from the apartment complex designs and placed you inside of there. So you saw it was a really nice, apartment complex. It wasn't ghetto, it wasn't like typically what people are thinking about when police shootings happen. So we want to show that aspect. The second thing is you also saw that it was raining. There was a light drizzle in Sanford, Florida that night, and so that kind of, when you're there on the ground and you see drizzling and you see a boy with his hood on, it makes a little bit more sense. There's all these things that you miss when you're just watching talking heads on cable news or reading on a newspaper. That visceral sense of being there provides so much more. And what we're doing is not telling you how to feel a certain way. We're combining the different facts of what's out there and placing you in the environment so that you can make decisions that are informed on your own by hearing people scream for help on his behalf and also seeing what the apartment complex looks like. So about these last 2 pieces, you'll notice that the graphics have this kind of pixelated look to them. These are about 3 years old now, or 4 for the other piece. Once we got the grant from the Knight Foundation to work with Frontline PBS and to collaborate with them and to figure out how these pieces that we made translate into some of the work that they do and to collaborate them, we knew that we had to figure out new techniques for making their standards, right?
Solitary confinement and a sensory deprivation.
It's Frontline PBS, and they have really rigorous standards in terms of how journalism can be produced and world recreation.
Insane. And I started hearing voices. I started having little imaginary friends that in my brain that I would make up. So, I would take blood and I would cover my cell and I would write messages all over my cell, help me, lyrics to songs that I knew all over the wall. I ripped all of the hair out of my body. It took me 3 days and I plucked all the hair, my leg, hair, chest hair. I looked like a completely different person. I would bite chunks out of myself. I cut myself thousands of times, just over and over and over and over and over again with razors. I cut my neck multiple times. I never thought that I could do something like that. I look in the mirror now and I don't even recognize myself sometimes. It's like, how could I do this to myself? How could I destroy the body that I love so much? But that's what solitary confinement does to you. It breaks you down and it turns you into a person that you never thought you could be. It turns you into an animal.
So in just 2 years, we've gone from these pixelated people running around and pixelated cars to photorealistic individuals and environments together. And so now we can be in a place and meet someone in VR and let them tell their story, and we're there with them. So with this piece, Frontline PBS had actually been working on a documentary, and this is some footage from that documentary, a traditional documentary, for about 4 years about solitary confinement and following Kenny and his life. He was 18 when he first went into prison in Maine, and they used solitary confinement as a practice on 18-year-olds. Basically, he was mentally unstable afterwards because of isolation, and he went in and out of solitary confinement and started, attacking guards more, adding more years to his sentence. And what's showing right here is actually what happens to people when they act out in solitary, is they get this treatment of, this is the only time they ever get to leave solitary, and so many people will actively, act up or, flood their cell in order to get out of the cell. But this is what happens. They get stripped naked and they get tied to this chair. And so after solitary shows a bit of like how solitary confinement haunts someone for a lifetime and how it actually adds years to people's sentence as a practice. Okay, so I'm going to move on to photogrammetry. And photogrammetry is actually a pretty groundbreaking technology that has existed for a while, but when applied to VR is quite useful, especially for journalists. What you see on the left here is just photo stills. And I say this is specifically relevant for journalists because all you need is a DSLR camera and a computer that can render a series of images. So I've gone around to newsrooms and I've done trainings on how to do photogrammetry, and it's actually it translates quite well for newsrooms because all they need is a DSLR and a photographer to go out and scan environments. So that was exactly what was done for his cell. So, part of our grant is knowledge sharing and helping other newsrooms figure out how they can bring our lessons that we've learned into their newsrooms. This should say Greenland melting, but this is our second piece that we did with Frontline PBS, and it's about Greenland. This piece is really important because it lets you go to a place that won't exist anymore, and probably some of the glaciers that you see now, it's not going to be how it is now. When we captured in that moment is a preservation, basically, of what's happening. And this piece lets you be with NASA researchers who are following the trends, and what they've learned is in the last 100 years, the melting has been equivalent to the last 10 years. So it's accelerated exponentially. The last 10 years of melting have been equivalent to the last 100. Sorry, I flipped that around. So it's just been an enormous amount of loss in terms of glacial land. This piece requires, we had to create a lot of environments. There were 7 times more environments than after solitary. So we had to do a bit of trickery because a lot of our source material were 360 videos like this. When we sent the crew out, they weren't able to do 3D scans. So our source material were 360 videos. How do we make that something you can walk around in when you know it's just a bubble around your head, right? Because I showed you earlier that 360 video, you can't move. You're stationary around it. But they're still pretty high resolution images. What we had to do is actually convert the image into a 3D model on the ground and add texture and depth to it. And this required, a bit of, stylization, I guess, with predicting how tall the rocks would be. It wasn't exactly a 3D scan with Z information, so we had to come up with that on our own to create and to continue the effect of 3D-ness, and so that you can walk around on the surface. So we haven't really been talking about the impact of our pieces so much, but we actually did do a study with the USC Norman Lear Center based at the University of Southern California, which is they're kind of like a think tank that studies media, and they ran a whole study with both of those pieces. And the major takeaways from them were that this magic of being there added that much value of appreciation for the content and the stories that they were learning about. So they reported more feelings of spatial presence, where they felt engaged with the natural and artificial environments of the artificial elements of the virtual environment. They reported feelings of connectedness. So it's something, this special feeling that you can't really quite get with traditional media, I want to say. There are ways of doing that, but I think with this piece, we're giving someone that magic of not being able to, of going to a place that won't exist anymore. And I can share that link to that study where you can read more about kind of our work. This is our last piece that we're doing in this series with Frontline PBS. It's a rather interesting case because in the first two, you're not able to do anything. You're just in a room and you share a presence with someone who went to solitary, and also you share a presence with the environment. This piece is more of one where the user actually has to do tasks in order to advance the story. So now the user is central and core, kind of like how use of force was, where you had to actually document the Border Patrol agents committing basically murder on homicide. And with this story, you're the detective, and in a real case that happened in Silicon Valley, where an Oracle executive was murdered in his house during a home invasion robbery in 2011. So what happened was people broke in, they tied him up, they didn't know he had a heart condition, and ended up killing him. And so in the autopsy, they found DNA in the victim's fingernail that matched with a homeless person. So immediately they found out who the homeless person was, and got a DNA match. He had been in prison before, had committed a couple petty crimes, and the jury ended up convicting the homeless person of the crime. And 4 months later, the public defender realizes that there's public records showing that the homeless man actually was in a hospital bed at the time and picked up by an ambulance and could not have committed a crime. He had a perfect alibi, no one realized. So how did the DNA get onto the victim's fingernail? So this is kind of a virtual whodunit crime VR experience, and you're responsible for kind of going through all step-by-step of the DNA testing in the lab and learning about how DNA testing and DNA evidence convictions are actually quite easy to be contaminated. I won't spoil exactly what happens because the case is quite interesting. Lastly, I want to talk a bit about making VR authorship, so making all of you be able to make VR experiences easier. So this is another grant that we got from the Knight Foundation, and we partnered a bit with Mozilla, which has been pushing open web source standards for virtual reality and augmented reality on browsers to let you construct VR environments on the browser. So this is kind of a transition in Emblematics, messaging, and Emblematic has always been interested in telling stories about people on the fringes of society and using emergent technologies to make people care about their stories, and also larger national issues through individual lenses. Now we are kind of interested in partnering, well, we have partnered with the New York Times and Washington Post on getting these into their newsroom. So going to the Supreme Court, doing photogrammetry of the Supreme Court, and creating a platform where anyone can use different photograms, and with just a simple green screen. So this is a survivor of Japanese American concentration. She's 93 and looks amazing and can still talk very presciently about her experience in camp. And so all we did was record her on a green screen backdrop with a DSLR. And so we're training, newsrooms on how this methodology can be used, because the end result is actually quite amazing and immersive. Because once you get photogrammetry and a 3D scan of environments, you can start to place people within these green screens within the environments. And so this is just a photogrammetry, and he was recorded on a green screen. And so now I have someone who is a survivor of concentration camp in America inside of a generic barrack, and he's sharing his story about what it's like. So I hope you guys are thinking about ideas of how newsrooms can start to implement this, because all you really need to make both of these assets is a DSLR, which most newsrooms have. And so what we're creating is a browser-based tool where you can upload individual green screen video files and choose the environment that you want. And so this is something that we launched at Sundance with Mozilla this year. And this is like green screen, little story booth that we created. Doesn't have to be like this, but we started interviewing individuals. And this is in a browser. Is there sound? But anyway, we live interviewed people and placed them inside of Volumetric Vr. So this is a bit different from 360 video because I could press this cardboard button here and walk around in the environment from my computer without having to run any other platform. So that's kind of what we're pushing for is, making VR accessible via browser so you don't have to download any apps. So just imagine clicking a link and then clicking this button to port to your headset, which headset prices are now lower. So hopefully adoption gets there. So that's kind of our latest effort. And if you're interested or you have any questions about kind of what we're doing with this, I'd be excited to hear about your feedback. And that's kind of all I have to share with you. I know there's a lot of visuals and a lot to absorb, but I encourage you to go back and visit the link and watch through all the videos, and please email me if you have thoughts, questions. And I think we're going to have a little Q&A. Do we have time? Yeah? Okay. Great.